I would like to thank Edita Sunjiski for the opportunity to speak to you today. I would also like to thank the Croatian Pedagogical Society and the International Ennea Conference, the annual Congress of Pedagogues. It's a real pleasure to be with you, even if only in a virtual way. My talk today is going to be very broad, and I'm going to be covering a number of themes. And I can send you some of the articles that I used as a basis for my talk at some point in time. Well, critical pedagogy has become a very broad, what we call umbrella term, that unites a disparate compendium of ideas from critical social theory that's been generated since around the 1970s. Numerous tributaries of educational theory and practice have grown out of the vast reservoir of critical educational thought, and these tributaries have appeared in tandem with social and political upheavals around the world. Essentially, critical pedagogy is a problem-posing approach to being in and transforming the world. And the term problem-posing, of course, comes from one of my mentors, my major mentor, Paulo Freire. Well, the dust never settles on critical pedagogy. It's a fluid social movement and philosophy. And it's a way of teaching against the grain, making the pedagogical more political and the political more pedagogical, as my esteemed colleague Henry Giroux would put it. It means moving outside and alongside conventional boundaries concerning race, concerning class, gender, sexuality, etc., creating the context for learners to independently think critically and use their lived experience to establish lifelong projects of serving others and helping students and their communities transform while holding established power relations accountable. Critical pedagogy acknowledges that our objective and subjective worlds are internally related. This understanding is central to comprehending what Paulo Freire meant by his term conscientization, the development of critical consciousness for the liberation of humanity. This eventually stipulates the development of a transformative praxis, the interpenetration of theory and practice, the knife edge upon which we balance our precarious lives, which requires that human beings, both individually and collectively, act as subjects in the world as opposed to being objects to be acted upon. So in other words, critical pedagogy is basically a medium for developing a transformative agency among human beings, a transformative agency, self-transformation and social transformation, and the two go hand in hand. You can't have self-transformation without social transformation. You can't have social transformation without self-transformation. So as an approach that's built upon theory and practice, or action and reflection, critical pedagogy is a dialectical philosophy that is very different from the rational, formal logic of, say, the positivistic sciences. In dialectics, things can only be understood in relation to each other and cannot be analyzed as independently existing pieces. Freire teaches that human consciousness is distinct because humans have the capacity to adapt to reality, plus the critical capacity to make choices and transform that reality. So it's only when we understand the dialectical relationship between consciousness and the world, that there is no separation between these, can we begin to read the word and the world simultaneously and transform the world. We understand that our consciousness comes from a dialectical mediation or interaction with that world and other humans. So we need to consider our consciousness first and foremost as social consciousness. We don't think independently from others. All of our ideas are populated by other people's meanings. Praxis occurs when we exercise our volition or our agency, along with our critical consciousness, to move beyond our conditioning process and social determinations in order to change the world. Another concept of Freire's is dialogue, and it's a key concept, dialogue. Throughout history, dialogue has helped us to communicate with each other much more critically, create solidarity among human beings, and it helps us collectively interact with the world. It prevents us from simply depositing our ideas into other people's minds, a process that Freire condemned as banking education. In dialogue, we can't treat others as objects. In dialogical learning, we are made and remade as learners and teachers. There have been a lot of books written about critical pedagogy, and, well, it's become a flourishing publishing industry. But the practical impact of critical pedagogy is hard to discern. It's really hard to measure. There are no doctoral programs, to my knowledge, in critical pedagogy that just focus on critical pedagogy. I was part of a PhD program at St. Thomas University many, many years ago. And it was a PhD in critical pedagogy. But that has been long since abandoned. And so it would be greatly welcomed if there were doctoral programs, for instance, focusing entirely on critical pedagogy, but that's not the case. There have been a lot of books written about critical pedagogy, and it's become a flourishing publishing industry. Again, there is now a range of political dimensions to critical pedagogy, including liberal, progressive educators identifying as critical pedagogues. They are very critical of Marxist critical pedagogues who advocate openly for education to be put in the service of building a socialist alternative to capitalism, right? So there's a range of political positions within critical pedagogy, from liberal, progressive, kind of centrist positions to more radical Marxist grounded approaches to critical pedagogy. One of the major evolutionary directions in which critical pedagogy is currently moving is, of course, digitalized learning. As machine learning, robotics, and virtual reality dominate our digital life worlds through expansion and market capitalization, critical pedagogy conceptualizes information as a form of social power. It's committed to resisting its weaponization, especially at a time of massive population surveillance through digital technologies. One of the major criticisms by students has been critical pedagogy's perceived focus on theory, which learners sometimes regard as too dense or too elitist. They are less likely to be readers of books than in my student days, for instance. Many students regard teaching as entertainment today. They don't want to get depressed learning about how difficult, painful, and exploitative the world can be, and this is very unfortunate. Other students and professors are trapped in the post-truth, fact-free universe of today's social media, where there exists no right or wrong, just temporarily held opinions about issues. There's a lack of understanding of what constitutes an argument, how to adjudicate the argument, and what constitutes an opinion. Students can retreat into their digital platforms where they do not have their ideas questioned or challenged. Teachers, too, can fall victim to these very same attitudes. Many of them focus on content without giving much thought to how students will respond. Students have sometimes responded in my class with the assertion, well, that's your opinion, Professor. I have my own. They don't really seem to be able to, in a sense, articulate the difference between an opinion and an argument, right? For example, I published a book on digitalized learning with a young Croatian professor, Petar Jandrić, but I do not consider myself as an expert in this area. I think it's the younger scholars who are moving critical pedagogy into new, important domains, such as digital learning, as well as intertrans and antidisciplinary approaches to the intersections between critical pedagogy and information and communication technologies. So students really need opportunities to acquire new and challenging experiences focusing on the socio-historical and political forces and contexts which reflect their own social identities. And that's very difficult to accomplish in today's classroom settings. Too many students receive knowledge passively in a decontextualized form for the students to memorize and repeat and standardize tests. Critical pedagogy, however, encourages students to grasp knowledge dialectically in relation to current problems and injustices, to transform society in the interests of social justice, within an ethics of compassion, an ethics of caring, and an ethics of fairness. What is needed is a problem-posing model of education which can lead to critical consciousness, resulting from a dialogical engagement about the manifold complexities of students' lives and lived experiences. So critical pedagogy isn't designed to offer solutions, ready-made solutions to oppression or to inequalities in our social universe. It's problem posing rather than solution giving. But that doesn't mean we can't try or don't try to offer solutions. Critical pedagogy is designed to create the conditions for educating creative thinkers who can individually and collectively contribute to the betterment of society and help the most immiserated and vulnerable as a result of having developed a dynamic, what I call protagonistic agency and awareness. Strategies, skills, and problem-solving approaches foster the creation of critical revolutionary intellectuals who understand that the social, the political, and economic realities of life can be challenged and can be changed. Students develop a political criticality spawned in the life world of dialogical engagement that leads to transformative praxis. In critical pedagogy, students and teachers together control the educational process to engage in a larger socio-political struggle, to challenge oppressive social conditions, and to work towards a more just, fair, and equitable society. Well, I have also, I think if I've contributed something to critical pedagogy, I think that it's my focus on liberation theology. And this was a focus that I developed from my work in Latin America. And I was educated about the nuns and the priests who were conversant in scripture and also conversant in the work of Karl Marx, who worked to liberate their communities from oppression. Students were interested in exploring various spiritual traditions. So I began classes in spirituality and critical pedagogy. I incorporated insights from the great theologians like José Porfirio Miranda and James Cone. They see their faith as aligned with what critical pedagogy is attempting to accomplish. Critical pedagogy then can sensitize students to the suffering of marginalized groups in society and create the conditions for dialogue and debate around issues such as systemic racism, the struggle of the LGBTQ community around the world, economic inequality, racism, the surveillance state, global capitalism, attacks on democracy and its global implications, disability rights, civil rights, women's rights. Well, critical pedagogy can be activated in many different sites and contexts. We're all learners. We all teach others. Teaching doesn't simply happen in a classroom. We all have insights that make practical impact on our own and others' lives. From the standpoint of critical pedagogy, teachers are not restricted to those formal educational institutions, like schools, universities. They are courageous individuals whom Freire describes as cultural workers, those who dare to teach in whatever context they find themselves. So I would say that critical pedagogy offers students various languages of criticism and possibility, critique and possibility, through which they can understand in a more nuanced and granular way the relationship between their individual subjectivity and the larger society. Well, put another way, these languages or discourses potentially serve as dialectical relays through which students can read the world against the act of reading the word, as Paulo Freire would put it. By that I mean reading one's lived experiences as those experiences are reflected in or refracted through various critical theories, such as various feminist theories, such as theories that connect gender, race, and political economy, such as theories that offer explanatory frameworks that can help students make sense of their own experiences. The idea is to create conditions of critical consciousness or critical self-reflexivity among students. The idea is to help students understand how various ideologies drive social life, to help students discern how systems of intelligibility, or what I call systems of mediation within the wider society. By wider society, I'm referring to nature, the economic system, right? The state, the social system, the cultural system, jurisprudence, schools, religion, etc. How they are mutually constitutive within the self. How are we formed by the state? How are we formed by religion? How are we formed by the social system, the cultural system, etc., 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 the economic system? So when we talk about liberation, what are we really talking about? When we talk about liberation, we're referring to self and social transformation. That is, to a dialectical relationship. So we need not refer to the self and social relations as though they were mutually exclusive categories, somehow antiseptically distant from each other. They are not steel cast terms, but rather bleed into each other. Right? Again, it's a dialectical relationship. It is at this point that we arrive at the concept of praxis, right? The bringing together of theory and practice. Of course, we demonstrate that praxis begins with personal agency, right? It begins with action, right? We begin, in other words, with practice and then enter into dialogue with others, reflecting on our practice. This reflection on our practice then informs our subsequent practice. And we call this process or mode of experiential learning praxis, Praxis, or self-reflective purposeful behavior. Right? That is, exploring with others the relevance of philosophical ideas to the fault lines of everyday life and the necessity to transform them. Now, it's really important to remember that being critically conscious is not a precondition for social justice action. But critical consciousness is an outcome of acting justly. We act in and on the world and then reflect on our actions in an attempt to effect a deeper, more critical change in society. We make society as society makes us. What takes priority in all of this is ethics, the purpose of creating a more just society without needless suffering. Liberation theologians refer to this as a preferential option for the poor and oppressed. I take this a little bit further and call it a preferential obligation to the poor and to those who are suffering. So critical pedagogy is a means to challenge the ideological hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. Successful graduation rates among students will not necessarily alter the material positions of those suffering within neoliberal capitalist societies. To date, public and private education has not helped to build a social order where equality, democracy, inclusivity, and criticality prevail. Mass schooling has socially reproduced class and racial hierarchies, which give greater purchase to the cultural capital of white students and the rich and middle class who are reconfiguring the society using their power, their privilege, and wealth to amass more power and privilege and to create the conditions of possibility for acquiring greater fortunes for themselves. Critical pedagogy is about the creation of critical citizenship, a breaking of the bunker mentality that you cannot negotiate with authority, and as a result, you remain in the crucible of consumer citizenship, in the thrall of the trend towards the businessification of education, from kindergarten all the way through high school, right through to university education, including the expansion of for-profit charter schools, by the way. Charter schools and voucher systems, which are destroying public education, public school education. We must ask these questions in a dialogical space. This could be a kindergarten or high school classroom, a law school, yes, a kindergarten classroom. That's a whole other story. Yes, we can teach critical pedagogy in kindergarten classes. This could be a K-12 classroom, a law school seminar room, or a church basement, or a community center. The purpose of the dialogue is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. It is a form of de-acculturation, of de-acclimation, of de-socialization, of questioning what we take for granted. But this is an existential, phenomenological process that doesn't follow, 100 prescribed steps. The intent is to build a psychosocial moratorium where the educator and the students abandon the hierarchy and the educator is willing to be educated by the students. And when this works, it creates what I've called a liminal space. By that I mean a subjective moment of what if? What if the world was like this and not like that? What if it were a place of joy, a place of love, a place of hope and solidarity, and not a place of precarity, fear, hatred, and division? What is society made of me? What do I like about that? And what do I want to change? How do we go about re-socializing ourselves so we can build a world where, for instance, capitalism does not flow from the laboring classes to the rich? How can we remake ourselves? How can we create spaces where we negotiate what we find meaningful in life? All aspects of life have a pedagogical dimension. All communication is pedagogical. When we see, for instance, the American flag in the classroom, that is a pedagogy, part of the official catechism of patriotism. So we negotiate and co-construct the curriculum with our students. The problem-posing dialogue generated with the students in the co-construction of the curriculum constitutes a pedagogy of disposition that enables students to use their lived experiences and their more formal understanding of society to read the world and the word. That is, to have a dialectical understanding of their own self and social formation, their own subjectivity. And this disposes them towards a path of liberation, a form of social action for change, a way of constructing themselves in society in a different way, one that respects diversity, equality, equity, the practice of peacemaking, and protecting the biosphere. This is the opposite of what Paulo Freire criticized as the traditional banking model of education, where knowledge is deposited into the brain pans of students as a means of socializing them to learn the right way. That is, to learn a technocratic, quantifiable way that socializes them to accept mainstream values, rules of behavior, and the myth of meritocracy. By meritocracy, I mean the notion that success comes to those who work hard, study, learn how to interact appropriately with others, and fulfill their duties as citizens. We want to make sure that the citizens that emerge from our schools are very competent decision makers, which means an engagement with a dialectical, praxeological approach to critical education. Now, we want to make sure that we create a class that actively pursues its own interests following the imperatives of critical dialectical deliberation in terms of what our future should look like. We need a mass movement from below to counter the much more advanced digitalization of today's entire global economy and society, which is utilized for its own ruling class interests, the application of fourth industrial revolution technologies led by artificial intelligence, and the analysis of big data. What do I mean by big data? Talking about machine learning, automation, robotics, nano and biotechnology, quantum and cloud computing, 3D printing, virtual reality, new forms of energy storage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not going to be an easy task, but it's a necessary one, since we will be continuing our struggle against the formation of a global surveillance state via digital realms, which techno-washes techno-washes racism in the service of crime prevention and national security. The sociologist William Robinson has warned that the acceleration of digital restructuring can be expected to result in a vast expansion of reduced labor or laborless digital services, including all sorts of new telework arrangements, drone delivery, cash-free commerce, fintech, which is short for digitalized finance, tracking and other forms of surveillance, automated medical and legal services, and remote teaching involving pre-recorded instruction. Uh-oh, this is pre-recorded. Robinson also notes that the global economy will now involve a more rapid, technological base. A fourth industrial revolution is upon us, characterized by a fusion of technologies, blurring the lines between the physical, the digital, and the biological spheres. More importantly, educational initiatives in our schools must be focused on preventing these new fourth industrial revolution technological advances from further rationalizing, legitimizing, and consolidating the logic of capital and its mechanisms of production and distribution that will only serve to advance the interests of 1% of the world's population. Such technologies must be put into the service of creating a social universe that is not premised on value production and monetized wealth, but rather on the reimagination and reorganization of our economic and social infrastructures. Society, culture, and social relations of production must be seen as inextricably interconnected, as entangled, to use a popular term from quantum physics. Well, what does it mean to operationalize a pedagogy of liberation? Over the decades, critical pedagogues have rethought the idea of teachers as transformative and public intellectuals, which is one of the many contributions of Henry Giroux. Teachers as researchers, which was a notion expanded upon by the wonderful and late and great Joe Kinchlow, and as cultural workers, something that has been formulated brilliantly by Paulo Freire. Now, Josh Wynne and the late Mike Neary have contributed to the important project of converting the university from a neoliberal corporation to a worker cooperative with teachers and students as producers, as protagonistic agents furthering the development of society for the commons, for the good of the commons, for the public good. Teachers and students together become active agents of history. Rather than enabling history to act on them, they act on history in a dialectical dance of revolutionary praxis. The university campuses can and should, in my view, become places of solidarity with social movements, new and old, as well as labor unions and teacher unions who may be open to alternatives to capitalism. As they stand, universities, unfortunately, are capitalist employers who reproduce academic labor in the form of student labor. According to Wynne, knowledge that is produced in this form of organization is powered through value production and exists mainly as a commodity form. By value production, I'm talking about basically monetized wealth. I'm not talking about values in terms of ethics. When I mention value production, I'm basically talking about monetized wealth. Now, when Neary and others call for the transformation of the university into a worker-owned and managed cooperative university that would control the means of knowledge production and potentially produce new forms of social knowledge through a common ownership form of property relations that transforms the distinction between public and private in order to create an academic commons designed for the good of the community. This would involve a new type of student-teacher relationship through forms of solidarity, equality, and mutuality in terms of the division of labor. Here, neoliberal business models based on institutional precedents would be replaced by Freirean dialogical models grounded in a historical materialist analysis that stresses the development of critical consciousness and protagonistic agency, and what Wynne and Neary refer to as the student as producer. Community of scholars comprising the cooperative university would co-construct the curriculum involving political struggles against the imperatives of capitalist value production. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Well, okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to offer some reflections for this wonderful conference. And hopefully, one day I'll be able to make it to Croatia. Take care. Bye-bye.